All right. Well, hello and welcome. I'm Holly Borum, Associate Curator of Prints, Drawings, and European Art at the Blanton Museum of Art at the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome to our series, Curated Conversations. Today, we're delighted to welcome art historian, Dr. Jamie Kwan. Welcome, Jamie. Just a few notes before we begin. Your audio is muted, so no one can hear you and only the panelists are visible on the screen. Closed captioning is available by clicking the live transcript icon at the bottom of your screen. We'll be taking your questions from the Q&A window, so just click on the icon below to type and send your questions. Feel free to make comments in the chat window, but please ask your questions through the Q&A box, and you're welcome to drop those in there at any point during Jamie's presentation, and we'll get to those most likely at the end, but we may interrupt and post some questions along the way as well. Today's event is being recorded and will be available on our website and our YouTube page roughly a week from today. So let's get started with today's program. Jamie Kwan is an art historian and curator based in Los Angeles. She received her PhD from Princeton University, where she studied early modern art history with a concentration on the French Renaissance. Her dissertation studies the role of portraiture under the reign of the first Bourbon king, Henry IV, and explores the creation of an absolutist imagery centered around the body of the king. Her research has been supported by a Fulbright grant, and she has held positions at the Getty Museum, the Getty Research Institute, the Huntington Library, and the Morgan Library. She is currently a curator at the Venda Museum and a lecturer at UC Riverside. Her talk today will illuminate some of the works in our current Paper Vault exhibition, Fantastically French, Design and Architecture in the 16th to 18th Century Prints, which is up through August 14th. For those of you who haven't been able to come and take a look at the show yet, I wanted to share a very brief trailer that gives a taste of the range of works in the exhibition, and then we'll hand it over to Jamie. Okay, I think that gives you a little taste, and now we'll hand it over to Jamie, who will show us a lot more from the exhibition and then connect it to actual objects and spaces and places. So thank you, Jamie. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So first of all, I would like to thank Holly, Rachel, and Justin for organizing this and inviting me to speak with you. I am so excited to discuss some of these prints from Fantastically French and the works, and we're going to look in depth today at works that range from the 16th to 18th centuries. These prints were made as designs to serve as inspiration for architects, artisans, and craftsmen decorating palaces and large, wealthy private homes. So in this presentation, we're going to visit the French royal palaces of Fontainebleau, which is just outside of Paris, and the very famous Palace of Versailles, to illustrate how these prints were used in interior design. These prints are really beautiful, and I really encourage you, if you can, to go into the galleries and see them in person. But it's always one thing to see them on the screen or on a wall, but it is another to really see how these prints were used and to bring the objects depicted in them to life. So first, I would like to welcome you to the Chateau of Fontainebleau, which we see here. Fontainebleau was an important residence under the height of the Valois dynasty. And the Valois was the ruling family that reigned over France from the 14th century until the end of the 16th. Fontainebleau was first built as a fortified castle in the Middle Ages, but it really came into its own as an important residence during the Renaissance in the 16th century under the king Francois I, or Francis I, who really expanded it, updated it, and renovated it, and decorated it in a very ornate and fashionable Italian Renaissance style. So the facade you see here is all from the 16th century, from Francis I, major renovation. So these sort of antique columns that or pilasters that you see here, these high-pitched roofs with gables, and this beautiful curving central staircase, these are all Francis's work. And indeed, Fontainebleau was Francis's favored residence. He used it as a hunting lodge, but also as a place to entertain dignitaries and members of the aristocracy. And aside from this, Fontainebleau also served as an important hub of artistic production under the Valois, due to Francis I's involvement. In the 1530s, Francis began to import Italian artists to run the artistic program at the chateau. And that meant that as a head artist, you would be in charge of many things. You would have to be a great multitasker, because you would create the interior decor, you would create objets d'art, like centerpieces and ornaments and little sculptures to decorate the chateau. You would also create costumes and set designs for festivals, banquets, pageantry, any sort of event that took place. Two of the most important artists, and artists impresarios really, because they did so much, were Rosso Fiorentino and Francesco Primaticcio, both of whom were Italians that were brought over to France in the 1530s to work on the artistic program of the chateau. In addition to inviting these artists, Francis I also established very prolific print studios that were based at the court. You have to remember that as a royal palace, Fontainebleau people had very limited access to Fontainebleau. It would essentially be open to, the king, his family, the aristocracy, and diplomats and dignitaries. In order to get his magnificent decor and art out to the world and to really show off his great taste, his patronage, and magnificence, Francis used print to disseminate the designs made by Rosso and Primaticcio. Since prints are portable, they're lightweight, they're fairly inexpensive, and they could travel not only across France, but across Europe. So other nobles, other bourgeois, other kings could see the designs that were created at Fontainebleau. So here is an example of one of these prints. This is an engraving, and it depicts a mural design that was created by Rosso Fiorentino. And just to it's a very complex image, and just to parse it out a little bit, you have a central oval compartment where you would have the mural depicting the Nymph of Fontainebleau. And I will speak a little bit more about this subject matter in just a couple of minutes. Surrounding this main compartment with the mural is this very elaborate sculptural framework. You have caryatids, these half woman, half architectural forms that sort of support the cornice. You have these little children with instruments and reading books. You have these grotesque animals and faces, swags of fruit and vegetables that draw from ancient Roman motifs. And then you have this strap work, these sort of curving leather-like forms. And these were motifs that were very popular at Fontainebleau and appear in many other forms around the chateau. So as I mentioned, this depicts a mural. And murals were actually a very new type of interior decor in France at this period, and were actually very Italian. France, as you may know if you visited Paris, has a fairly cold and wet climate. So traditionally, interiors, grand interiors would be decorated with wood paneling and tapestries. Tapestries are very costly. They are very labor intensive. And the centers of tapestry making were located in Northern Europe. However, during the Renaissance, Francis I wanted to bring a new Italian style of decor to the chateau. And so he had these Italian artists paint in fresco, which is the technique of applying pigment directly onto fresh plaster to create these very vivid and bright colors. And so Fontainebleau today is known for its beautiful murals and frescoes in the Galerie François I, which is essentially a long hall in the chateau that is decorated with these murals and sculptural frameworks throughout. It's very grand, and it was really the jewel of the chateau. It was a place where Francis would take all of the ambassadors and dignitaries to really show off his artistic patronage and his good taste. And so here is the mural that the print is based off of. You can see just how closely the print has recreated the elements of this work. You have the central painting, and then you have this sculptural framework that is made of plaster, as well as some fresco here with the painted children, and then gold, and this gold is executed in mosaic. Unfortunately, because of the climate in France, many of the frescoes in the Galerie François I, or the Gallery of Francis I, are not very well preserved. Rain, dampness are very bad for frescoes. So unfortunately, this work was heavily restored in the 19th century. However, it still gives you a sense of how this would have looked in situ in the 16th century. And here is a view of the Galerie François I. You're looking down the hall, and you can see this is a very ornate space. You have these carved ceilings, and then on the walls, you have these wooden panels with carved heraldry and insignias and devices. And then up above, you have the series of frescoes, which you see here, and their frames, which are executed in plaster. And the Nymph of Fontainebleau would have been in the center of the gallery, so it would be somewhere about here. And so I'd also like to talk a little bit more about the theme of the Nymph of Fontainebleau. And so what we see here is a lovely female figure. She is she resembles the forms from classical antiquity. And this subject refers to the foundation of Fontainebleau and the legends surrounding the founding of the site. As I mentioned, Fontainebleau was used as a hunting lodge. So, and at the location, you have the chateau, you have a small town or village serving the chateau, and then you have a vast forest. And according to the legend, a hunting dog ran into the forest and found a nymph and her sacred spring, and that became the site for the chateau and for the hunting lodge. So here we see the nymph, we see the hunting dog here discovering her, and then you have this vase with water flowing out of it as a reference to the sacred spring. This subject was prevalent throughout the chateau, and so we see it not only on murals in the Galerie François I, but we also see it in sculptural form. Here is a monumental bronze lunette by the Italian artist Benvenuto Cellini, who was also brought over to France by Francis I. Although Cellini worked primarily as a sculptor and goldsmith. Here we see a very similar composition with the recumbent nymph. She is nude. She has very classicizing proportions. And then we have animals referring to the hunt, a wild boar, a stag, a deer, and then to the far right, you have the hunting dogs. And again, the vase with water flowing out of it as a reference to the spring. The work you see right here is the original and is at the Louvre. But here we see a reproduction that is placed at Fontainebleau. So you can really get a sense of the context of this work. It is monumental, it is quite grand, and it would hang over one of the main doorways of the chateau as a beautiful work of art and as a reminder of the function of Fontainebleau. And so as a hunting lodge, Fontainebleau was a place of leisure and of pleasure. And as I mentioned, it would be the site of pageants, festivals, and banquets. The Renaissance Banquet was a very elaborate affair, as you can tell from this image. This shows an example of the Renaissance Banquet of Charles V and Isabel of Portugal, as well as their son Philip II of Spain and his wife Anne of Austria. So this isn't a French banquet, but it is contemporaneous, and it gives you a sense of just how grand this sort of affair would be. Everyone would be dressed to the nines, as you can see from their very elaborate clothing and hairstyles. There would be many different courses of exotic and rare foods. There would be entertainment, singing, performances, dancing, and of course, the space itself would be elaborately decorated. You can see in the background the tapestries here. And also to the left side, we have this sort of stage setting with dishware. And so this is what we call a credenza, and essentially served as a display of the royals' best silverware, dishware, glassware. All of these dishes and, glasses, ewers you see here were never meant to actually be used. They were purely ornamental as a way to show off the good taste of the ruler and their magnificence. In this same vein of display, artists and impresarios would also create really elaborate centerpieces for banquets. And here we see one of my favorite prints from the exhibition, a design for a table fountain. The print is by René Boivin, who had a print studio in Paris, but this is based on a design by Rosso Fiorentino. And if it's not by Rosso Fiorentino, it may have been done by Rosso's his assistant, Léonard Thierry, who worked in a style based on Rosso and really disseminated his aesthetic. So this work is, I think it's very fascinating. This central compartment was intended to hold a liquid, probably wine, which would flow from these little figures. You have these very playful and a little obscene urinating putti. And then you have these little baby tritons blowing shells, and you see the liquid flowing out of them as well. Because of this, because it's a fountain, we see these aquatic themes. So you have the tritons, you can see their little mermaid tails, and then decorating the basin, you have snails and turtles encrusting the edge, and then serving as the feet are dolphins. But given the fact that Fontainebleau was also a hunting lodge, the artist has included themes related to the hunt. So up here, these reliefs depict scenes from the myth of Diana and Actaeon from ancient Roman mythology. Actaeon was a hunter who had the misfortune of running into Diana, goddess of the hunt, while she was in her bath. And the goddess became so infuriated that she punished Actaeon by turning him into a stag, and then he was promptly mauled by his own hunting dogs. So you see the scene of him spying her in her bath here, and then the scene of him being mauled by his dogs in this relief. Rather grisly, but nonetheless an important theme related to the hunt, as well as royal or divine power and what happens if you question that. This work would probably have been executed in metal. It would have been made by a goldsmith, and these forms would be in the round, and these panels would be in relief. Unfortunately, an example of a fountain based on this print doesn't exist, but I can show you some other examples of table fountains from the 16th and 17th centuries. Here is one from Germany from about 1560. Contemporaneous, more or less, with the design by Rosso. And here, the designer has also decided to use the theme of Actaeon, of Diana and Actaeon. Here you have poor Actaeon. He's already part stag, and here is his hunting dog. And then below you have nymphs and mountain goats. And here are two more examples of other table fountains. Both of these are a little later. They're from the 17th century, and these feature aquatic themes. They both have tritons at the top who are blowing shells, nymphs and sea gods. You can tell this figure is probably Neptune. He has his little triton there. And you have these shell-like forms serving as the basin here and here, as well as these dolphins serving as the base. So as demonstrated by these examples, the court of Francis I and the chateau of Fontainebleau became associated with this very distinct aesthetic, one that featured sensual figures and mythological motifs, drawing from antiquity. And this was due to the artists that Francis I imported from Italy, but also due to the print studios that he supported, as these really helped to disseminate the designs and motifs across not only France, but around Europe. And so designs such as the prints we saw after Rosso became closely associated with the French Renaissance and with Valois rule. But now I would like to move on from the Renaissance and take a look at some designs from the 17th century, when France was ruled by a new dynasty, the Bourbons. The Valois dynasty came to a rather unfortunate end. The end of the 16th century was marked by a series of religious and civil wars. The religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, and the civil wars came about due to conflict over succession, as the last Valois king, Henry III, died without a male heir. Eventually, Henry of Navarre ascended to the throne and embarked on a long military campaign to claim the throne and to pacify the nation. And eventually, Henry of Navarre was successful, and he became the first ruler of the Bourbon dynasty. He became King Henry IV. And the Bourbon dynasty would include very famous monarchs, such as his grandson, Louis XIV. During this new rule, we see politically, we see a consolidation of royal power and the rise of absolutism. And naturally, the ornate decor of the 17th century, which we associate with Versailles, was part and parcel of that. Decor and visual aesthetics were really an important aspect of demonstrating the power, grandeur, and military might of the monarch. So here is an etching by Jean Lepotre. It is a design for a chimney piece, and it features an equestrian statue of a Roman emperor, and was made around 1640. Jean Lepôtre originally trained as a cabinet maker, but later became an engraver and designer who worked at the Gobelin manufactory, which made tapestries and furniture for the royal family. Lepôtre created many, many designs, and this chimney piece comes from a series of designs for chimney pieces. You have to remember that before central heating, the chimney was, or the hearth was, the main source of warmth in a room. And you can imagine just how cold it would be in a stone chateau in the middle of winter. So in the 16th century, we see increasingly elaborate chimney designs, either ones that were painted or carved. And this is a trend that goes through the 17th and 18th centuries, where we see these increasingly elaborate designs for chimneys. This one was likely made for royal use because it features a Roman emperor who would actually serve as a portrait of the king himself. By referring to ancient Rome, the king could associate himself with the power of the imperial Caesars, such as Julius Caesar. And of course, the equestrian portrait refers to famous Roman antiquities, such as the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, which today is at the Capitoline Museum in Rome. And so this is an example of demonstrating royal military might. You have the emperor, or it would be the king in the guise of a Roman emperor, on a rearing horse, and underneath he has his vanquished enemies. In this lower register, you see two little winged victories. They are blowing trumpets, and underneath in this circular compartment is a relief of a battle scene. Above, you see this use of ancient Roman motifs of garlands and swags and wreaths, as well as imperial Roman eagles with heraldry in the center. So this design for chimney piece by Lepôtre was made in 1640, but it actually has an earlier origin, and Lepôtre is most definitely looking at an earlier example, one of the most famous equestrian chimney pieces, and perhaps one of the earliest made in France, and that is the Belle Cheminée, or the Beautiful Chimney, commissioned by Henry IV. After Henry pacified the realm, he began an extensive artistic program to really promote his rule. He inherited Fontainebleau, which was the residence of his Valois predecessors, and sought to really make the space his own. So part of this was a large commission to create a monumental chimney at the chateau that would feature an equestrian portrait of the king surrounded by battle reliefs and motifs referring to ancient Roman victory. So it would have swags, eagles, and winged victories. This chimney piece would have been very grand and would have been very elaborate, and most likely looked very similar to the design by Lepôtre. Unfortunately, the La Belle Cheminée was totally dismantled during the French Revolution, and all of its pieces were scattered. So we have some of the reliefs and ornamental aspects at the Louvre. But at Fontainebleau, we have the main equestrian portrait relief here. We see Henry on horseback. He is in the guise of a triumphant Roman emperor. Unfortunately, we don't have the reliefs and other parts of the chimney that would accompany this. But this does give you a sense of just how large and grand this chimney would have been. To the right is another example of a chimney designed by Lepôtre. This one is not quite as grand in scale, probably because it was not made for the king. Roman style equestrian portraits were reserved just for the monarch. But we do see an interest in these motifs from the antique. We have, again, the winged victories, We have more of a floral design because we have a female bust, and then we have these little satyrs. And this chimney piece comes from the Chateau du Chay in Chirac, which was on the west coast of France. So these equestrian chimney pieces were intended as flattering portraits of the king to show his military might and magnificence in rule and patronage, and to draw these parallels between the king and ancient Roman Caesars. The important role interior design played in shaping the identity of the king is perhaps best illustrated in this example of a chimney piece from Versailles. This one was made circa 1680, and it is by Antoine Poissevaux. It depicts Louis XIV, Henry IV's grandson, in the same guise of a Roman emperor on horseback. And so you see that in this circular marble relief. Again, you have the rearing horse, you have the vanquished enemies, and then above in gilt, you have winged victories. One is blowing a trumpet, another is holding a wreath, and then you have heraldry below, enslaved figures who represent the vanquished, his vanquished enemies, and below an allegory of victory with little Putti holding the armor of Louis XIV. And this work, very appropriately, is in the Salon de la Guerre at Versailles. It is in the war chamber. And so this chimney piece really brings us to probably one of the most famous residences of all time, Versailles. Here is a shot of the exterior. It's very ornate, and Versailles, if you visited it, is sprawling. It is extremely grand. It is probably the most famous palace of all time and associated with opulence and splendor. But originally, Versailles had a very humble start. It was first built as a hunting lodge by Louis XIV's father, Louis XIII. And it wasn't until Louis XIV's rule that Versailles really took this grand form. Louis XIV, due to a series of uprisings, really hated Paris. And as soon as he could, fairly early in his reign, moved the entire court over to Versailles. And he embarked on this lifelong project of expansion and renovation of this original hunting lodge. So he added many wings and annexes. He expanded the grounds and then built other complexes within them. And so here is a view of the grounds. This is sort of a bird's eye view from the back of the chateau looking out. You see this very beautiful organized garden with pools of water and fountains. We see this very manicured lawn and hedges and the Grand Canal. This design is very geometric, it's very organized, it is axial, and it was meant to really give Louis a dominion over his land. He could stand out and just gaze out and see everything that belonged to him. Here is another view. It is of the same parts of the garden, except taken from a lower perspective. So we have the fountain of Latona here, as well as the manicured lawns and bushes and hedges. You can see the forest to the side and the central canal. And so part of these sprawling grounds included garden sculpture and decorating the walks and groves and fountains of Versailles. And you can see examples here of figural sculptures, but also of these monumental antique style vases. And so here we see two examples for vase designs, one by Jean Lepôtre to the left, which was made around 1640, and one to the right by Jacques-François Joseph Sally, which is made about a century later in 1740. And even though this was made later, you can see there is this continued interest in antiquity and these fantastic designs to decorate royal spaces. Both of these draw on are inspired by ancient Roman examples, but are really fantastic. This one by Lepôtre is marine in its theme. We see these tritons and seahorses, a relief with what looks like mermaids, these hybrid chimera dragon-like forms, and these shell and scale patterns and encrustations. And to really highlight the fact that he was drawing from antiquity, Lepôtre even placed the vase in an antique setting, in an ancient Roman setting. You have the interior of a Roman house with frescoes, and then you have people in ancient garb and togas. Sally's work, while lacking the elaborate background, is also very fanciful. You see two female sphinxes serving as the handles of the vase. There are floral motifs, and then these very strange faces that draw from ancient Roman theater masks. So these prints of vases were meant to serve as sources of inspiration for the stonemasons who would actually be the ones carving the stone and creating the actual works that would go into the garden. However, these prints, as you can see by their detail, were really works of art in and of themselves. They were meant to show off the creativity and imagination of the printmaker. And both of these are parts of larger series of vase designs that were meant to be collected and enjoyed purely for aesthetic purposes. And so we have the designs here. And here we have some actual vases. As you can see, they're not quite as fanciful. It would be extremely difficult to carve something like Lepôtre's design in stone. But nonetheless, we see this interest in the grotesque and in the antique. This vase features a relief with ancient Roman figures, these floral motifs with acanthus leaves, and then this grotesque face. And you can see in the background one of the wings of Versailles with this ornamental sculpture that really pairs well with the sculpture in the garden. And here is another example of a vase at Versailles. This one's slightly different. We have these floral motifs with a ribbon, these swags, acanthus leaves, the same grotesque type mask or face. And then they're a little hard to see because they are facing the other side, but you have these hybrid female caryatid figures who seem to support the rim of the vase. So now that we've explored just a little bit the exterior of Versailles and its gardens, I would like to now turn to the interior, and just to set the mood, here is an image of one of Versailles' most famous spaces, the Galerie des Glaces, or the Hall of Mirrors. This really just gives you a sense of how sumptuous the interior of Versailles was. You have here glass and crystal, both of which were very precious materials back in the 17th century. You have gilt sculpture, and then you have this very elaborate barrel vault that is painted and gilt as well. To fill these grand spaces, the king had the Gobelin manufactory. As I mentioned, a manufactory that created tapestries and furniture at his disposal. And naturally, large pieces of furniture served as eye-catching showpieces in a room. And so this, while perhaps not as eye-catching as all of the gold we just saw, this is a print for marquetry design from about 1660 to 1670 by Jean-Philippe Boule, who was a member of the family of royal furniture makers. And this family was so known for its distinctive style of marquetry and craftsmanship that furniture made in this manner is now called the Boule style. And the Boule worked in marquetry, which is a technique of inlaying a complex pattern, often in gold-colored brass, pewter, or tortoiseshell, into the wood. Jean-Philippe Boule's father, André Charles Boule, was so known for this technique and style that he was appointed the official cabinet maker for the King Louis XIV. However, this style remained popular even after André Charles' death, as we can see from this later design by his son, which incorporates these key Boule elements, and these elements are the very playful figures. You can see this man gesturing, this guy in costume, this man with a sword, and this warrior. They're very theatrical and playful. And these swirling vegetal arabesques and curlicues were also very typical of Boule's style. You have to imagine, as marquetry, all of this blank space would be the wood panel. And then all of the design would be inlay in a bright metal or tortoiseshell, creating this very striking and luxurious contrast. We can see here in these two cabinets how this print would have been translated, especially in this large panel to the left. You can see really how sumptuous these designs are and just how much labor it would take to translate the print, which in and of itself is quite elaborate, into a design in metal and wood. This marquetry, with its very sumptuous, rich colors and complex ornament, really embody the interior design popular under Louis XIV. And here is another picture with Boule style marquetry, except we see it in situ. This is also at Versailles, and it is the Salon of Abundance. You can see just how these color palettes really match. The gilt of the furniture matches the gilding of the cornice, the ceiling, and the dark wood really pairs well with these rich jewel tones and textures used to decorate these rooms. And so this is very typical of 17th century taste and of the style at Versailles and Louis XIV. However, by the mid-18th century, taste had gradually changed to something quite different. I think a lot of us associate the 18th century with the Rococo, and the Rococo aesthetic is very light and playful in contrast to the heaviness and pomp and grandeur of the previous century. Rococo aesthetic favors pastels, so ice cream colors like pink, light green, pale blue, cream color, and the use of floral ornament, as well as these very fantastic naturalistic forms such as shells. This floral pattern by Anne Allen, I think, really embodies the Rococo. It was made between 1775 and 1800, and it depicts some flowers that are real. So these roses, and I can recognize a tulip here, as well as some completely imaginary ones, such as these that have both red and green petals. And this play between the natural and real with the imagined and fantastic is very Rococo. It is playful, it is fanciful. This colored etching was executed by Anne Allen But it was based on a drawing by Allen's husband, who is the renowned designer Jean-Baptiste Pilmont, who was known for his chinoiserie designs. So the Rococo period also saw the rise of chinoiserie, which was a style based on motifs and images from China that were sort of transformed for European tastes. They were by no means accurate depictions of Chinese imagery, but were meant as these sort of pastoral and fanciful images of essentially the Orient. And so this print comes from a book of floral etchings that was intended to serve as sources of inspiration or even templates for painters and designers. And floral motifs during this period were especially popular for wallpaper and textiles. Here we can see a very similar floral motif in the wallpaper, as well as in the upholstery. And of course, we cannot discuss the Rococo without mentioning one of the most famous queens, Marie Antoinette. And so here we have the interior of her billiard room at Versailles in the Petit Appartement de la Reine, so the queen's smaller chambers. As you can see in this close-up of the wallpaper, you have these pastel colors. You have this interest in blank space and superimposing the floral designs on this blank space. And it is very light and elegant. On a grander scale, we can see similar floral designs in the upholstery and walls of Marie Antoinette's official bedroom. This is the chamber of the bedchamber of the queen at Versailles. It is much grander because it is an official room. You have the gold gilding and these very elaborate plaster designs up here. But nonetheless, we still see this interest in this lighter floral motif used to decorate and used in the textiles. On a more humble scale, we have this side chair, and you can see just how similar this design is to Anne Allen's. You have this sort of irregular pattern of leaves and flowers and berries scattered on this cream blank background. It is very elegant and it is very light, and you see this use of pastel colors. And aside from upholstery, we also see the use of these floral patterns in textiles for clothing. We see this beautiful dress. It is a robe à l'anglaise. It is from about 1760. And the pattern here is very similar to Anne Allen's design. And actually, the curators of the Met, where this dress is located, believe that this pattern itself was based on one of the designs, the chinoiserie designs by Anne Allen's husband, Jean-Baptiste Pilmont. So you have these flowers and pastel colors scattered in these irregular forms. It is, again, very light and elegant and playful. So in this handful of prints, we have spanned 3 centuries of French interior design, from the Renaissance all the way to the Rococo in the 18th century. I really hope you've enjoyed exploring this intersection of printmaking, design, and daily life, as well as this peek into the lifestyles of the rich and royal with me. And so thank you so much for joining me today.
That was fabulous, Jamie. Thank you for taking us on such a journey into beautiful spaces, yes, that most of us haven't had the opportunity to enter, and 300 years ago certainly wouldn't have had the opportunity to enter. So that was just delightful. To our audience, please go ahead and put questions into the Q&A box, and I'll get started with the first question that's already been entered there. Could you talk a little bit more about the vases at Versailles, and did they have a particular purpose? I guess to us, they might look like planters, but did they have a purpose?
Yeah, so their purpose is purely ornamental. I think some could be used as planters, but realistically, they were meant to be placed strategically. Versailles garden is very geometric. It's very symmetrical. You would have these axial alleyways where you could just see straight down, and vases and other sculpture were used to enhance this space. So they're purely ornamental. They're just very beautiful works of art in the garden.
And then could you also talk a little bit about the idea of the hunting lodge, and what is the role of the hunt? Why is it so special to these kings?
Sure. So as I mentioned, Fontainebleau was a hunting lodge, and Versailles, before it became this magnificent palace, originally was a hunting lodge. And so the hunt was really important to kings across Europe, not just in France. Hunting was a privilege, especially hunting large animals such as boar or deer, stags. Hunting was a privilege reserved for the nobility, and especially for the monarchy or for the kings. And so hunting and having these large grounds to do one's hunt was a symbol of royal power and dominion. These were your lands. You had the privilege of hunting there. And in addition to this display of essentially land ownership, hunting was a way of demonstrating skill and strength and savvy that was supposed to translate to the battlefield, but was really to show off virility and manliness and good horsemanship, all of these things that are valued back then. That's fascinating when you think about, and so the kings themselves were supposed to be able to demonstrate this level of, I suppose they're trying to show themselves as emperors who can conquer human foes as well as these scary boars as well. So there's a question about how long it took to construct Versailles. So what would it have been like to live on a construction site for 40 years? Oh my goodness. So Louis started constructing Versailles when he was quite young, and it continued. Versailles was a work in progress, and that was often the case for many of these residences. There would always be something that would be under construction because these were lifelong projects, and sometimes things would be put on pause because of lack of funding. So when Louis had an unsuccessful war venture, things would be put on pause. So the answer is the construction never ended. And in addition, later heirs would build their own galleries or wings or buildings on the property to really make their own mark as well and to make the palace their own. So living in one of these chateaux, as you mentioned, Holly, was probably like constantly living in construction, although these are big enough so that you can probably avoid the sections that are being under renovation.
Yeah, well, I think they're living places, right? So there's even if you preserve it, they redecorated spaces constantly too. So
exactly.
Today, when we're looking back at the earlier times and thinking about which moments to preserve, just recognizing that they also redecorated just like we want to redecorate.
Exactly. And so it's both good and bad, because you have to remember these places they were alive and they would change constantly. And so Fontainebleau, while I only spoke about the 16th century portions, actually has many wings from Napoleon's time that are very well preserved as well. So it's great if you're a 19th century expert, but also a little sad if you study the Renaissance, because it meant that many of the Renaissance works were destroyed to create these later apartments.
Right. Well, and it's fascinating. We also have a question kind of along those lines is, were people in the past thinking about preserving all of their art, architecture, and decor for future generations, or did they have different, I guess, were they thinking about preservation or just kind of what's fashionable in the moment?
I think it really varies from monarch to monarch. There is this desire for preservation in terms of filial piety. So, for example, Louis XIV wanted to honor the memory of his father, and he did that by enclosing the original hunting lodge within the larger Chateau of Versailles. So that was one way of preserving it and being filial. But, if you look at Fontainebleau, things were totally destroyed, and there was less of an interest in preserving these Renaissance apartments. So I think it varied in the relationship. Napoleon probably did not care very much about these earlier Renaissance apartments when he wanted to make his own. But then certain aspects, because they were visually interesting, aesthetically pleasing, were removed and placed in other locations. So it was really personal, and it was really whatever the king wanted.
And we're getting a flood of questions, so we do have to wrap up pretty soon. So I'm going to have to, I'm afraid, pick and choose amongst these. There was a question about, was there a middle class that would copy the style of the royalty and have their own knockoff versions?
Yes, that they would. And that is why the prints were so useful. So these prints entered into urban centers. And so you could go to a goldsmith with a print and essentially commission something that looked similar. It probably would not be as grand. It would probably use different materials, but the idea is that you could imitate your betters, your social betters.
And then can you tell us what happened to Versailles and Fontainebleau during the French Revolution? How much was destroyed and desecrated at that time?
A good amount was destroyed. So it's a lot of at Fontainebleau was destroyed. As I mentioned, the Belle Cheminée was totally dismantled. And I think in addition to desecration, it was also an issue of neglect and just letting things molder, especially things like frescoes. A lot of sculpture was torn down, but some of it was just not caring about preservation because these were the works of kings. And so that was a casualty of the revolution.
I don't want to end on that sad note, but I'm thrilled that you have resurrected so many of these places for us and invited us into them, and that we have the prints that give us a taste of what some of these places looked like. So Jamie, thank you so much. This has been super informative. And thank you for your time today.
Yes, this is so much fun. Thank you so much for joining me. And thank you, Holly, for inviting me to speak today.
My pleasure. So just a few kind of closing words here. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Next month's curated conversation, we'll be talking to best-selling Austen author Sarah Bird, whose new book takes you inside the crazed dance marathons during the Great Depression and was inspired in part by one of the most beloved paintings in our collection, Dance Marathon by Philip Evergood. And I'll just say the first courier trip I got to take was to go to Germany to bring back that painting that had been borrowed by a German museum. So it is world famous painting. If you haven't seen the painting, check it out upstairs in our American Art Gallery, and be sure to join us and Sarah Bird on July 13th. And then finally, if you'd like to show your support for the Blanton, become a member today at blantonmuseum.org/membership. Sign up for our Blanton news at blantonmuseum.org/subscribe to always be in the know about what's happening at the museum. You can watch the entire Curated Conversations series at blantonmuseum.org/curated conversations and learn more about volunteer opportunities at blantonmuseum.org/volunteer. Thanks again, and we hope to see you next month. Bye.